effects. I mean, it might not be just such a simple, you know?
What in God's holy name are you blathering about?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm blathering about. I've got information, man. New shit has come to light.
Welcome to Cinemaholics. I am John Agroni as usual, and with me I have Will Ashton. Hi, Will.
Hi, John.
We're doing this bonus discussion of Chaos Walking, and one of the reasons we're doing this outside of the normal format of the main show is because so many movies came out this week. We thought that it would be a little bit easier. Too many. We thought it'd be easier just to, I don't want to say get this one out of the way. That's kind of mean to this movie, right? But to give it some extra time.
I mean, this one, it's had such a long production, such a long road to the finish line. We figured, why keep it waiting? It had to wait this long to get to theaters. Let's just get it out of the way pretty early on. It was filmed all the way back in like 2017, I think, or something. So let's just, it
let's
deserves
get into that.
Yeah.
It deserves a lot of time, and Abiel Chessie is not interested in seeing this one anyway. So Will and I decided, let's just knock this one out on a Thursday, and that's why you're hearing this now. Okay, Chaos Walking. It is, as we have alluded to, a film that has been long in the making. It's actually based on a YA trilogy called Chaos Walking, and it's a sci-fi kind of action-adventure western trilogy of books by Patrick Ness. And the first book is called The Knife of Never Letting Go. Kind of a convoluted title, I think. But Will, have you ever read these books? Or did you even hear about these books before the movie stuff was involved?
No, I mean, my only, I think, familiarity with Patrick Ness, the author, is that he wrote the source material for A Monster Calls, I believe, from a few years ago, if I recall correctly.
That might be true. I never saw Monster Calls, so I'm not as familiar, but yeah.
And I know I think he helped with the screenplay for this one. I think he also wrote the screenplay for A Monster Calls as well, so he has...
I do know that, he did. He co-wrote this screenplay with Christopher Ford, and it's directed by Doug Liman, and we might as well... Don't worry. I was going to say it's such a complicated thing. So we're kind of like, oh gosh, where do we even begin with this thing? So let's take it back to the basics. Lionsgate originally announced that they had gotten the rights to make this film. So for context, like 2011, decade ago, almost a decade ago, because it was like later 2011, we had just had Hunger Games. The Harry Potter series just ended. And YA was really like a hot commodity as I don't want to say genre, because it's not a genre necessarily. It's sort of like it's like a series, a subgroup of films, a category of films, maybe more similar to like the superhero blockbuster kind of thing. And it was the kind of thing where everybody wanted to make the next Hunger Games, the next Harry Potter, and all of that. And Chaos Walking was originally going to be kind of like that. It was supposed to be coming out around the same time as something like The Maze Runner. And what happened though was it took them a while to get this thing like really set up in pre-production. They didn't have it cast until 2016, but it was looking pretty promising in 2016 because they got Daisy Ridley and Tom Holland. So more context, a lot of you might remember this. Tom Holland in 2016, he's coming right off of Captain America Civil War, his breakout role. Nowadays we see so many films with Tom Holland, it's kind of easy to forget that like nobody knew who this guy was before Captain America Civil War, except maybe if, like people more familiar with like British television and all that.
Oh, and the big fans of In the Heart of the Sea, of course.
I even forgot. He was in the Heart of the Sea? I know he was in Lost City of Zed, which was like the other kind of like forgotten thing, but okay. That said, people they weren't super familiar with Tom Holland quite yet. They knew that he'd been cast as Spider-Man, and then this movie comes along and Lionsgate is like, okay, we get this guy, our sci-fi YA movie is going to be all the more successful. It's a very smart move on their part. They also have Daisy Ridley coming right off of Star Wars The Force Awakens, which had just come out like 6 months ago at that point. Clearly they were shooting for a film that was going to make, who knows, like $700-800 million at the box office. They would hope, probably more like 500 if things had gone according to plan. So 2017 rolls around and they're finally finishing up casting, and it's just taking a while for them to get all of that stuff done. There was there were a bunch of rewrites, and I didn't get into this, but Charlie Kaufman originally had a draft of the screenplay, but also Jamie Linden, John Lee Hancock, Gary Spinelli. It wasn't until like the very end that we get to the Christopher Ford and Patrick Ness version of the screenplay, and we really have no idea how different this film would have been under those other pens. But clearly, Lionsgate, it almost feels like they have the rights to this thing that they really believe could be massive. Like they really have high hopes for this. And it's almost like they really want to play it safe. They really want to make sure they don't make any like huge unforced errors with this thing, explaining why the development took so long. I mean, it's 2011, 10 years ago. And by the time they actually started shooting the film, and it wrapped sometime around like late 2017, and they start showing it to test audiences, that part doesn't go well. So people rejected this film apparently in the focus groups. So they had to approve a bunch of rewrites and reshoots. And the reshoots, though, got delayed even further because by this point, okay, we've had Spider-Man Homecoming has come out, Star Wars The Last Jedi has coming out, Murder on the Orient Express with Daisy Ridley as well. At this point, Tom Holland and Daisy Ridley are so busy, their careers are so slammed that they couldn't even get them for the reshoots. And so they had to keep delaying that. They weren't able to do just a month of reshoots until spring 2019. And I think like March 2019 was the original release date. So that's kind of telling you how just Lionsgate was really, really dealing with a lot of issues with getting this film put out there and done.
A lot of chaos.
There you go. That's the word I'm searching for. So they finally have the reshoots done, and they were going to be like, all right, so then they were going to let it sit for another year because at that point, 2019 is basically all set and finished and, in terms of what's going to come out. So then 2020 was going to be the year, right? Well, Ashton, 2020, that's when this movie came out?
In theory, yeah. In their hopes, that's when it would have come out. Or at least I think that's when they wanted to just dump it at that point, just kind of get it off their hands.
Probably, yeah. We have to mention Fede Alvarez actually directed the reshoots too, so another director coming in for Doug Liman. So
yeah, because I remember hearing that Doug Liman was either only partially involved with the reshoots or not at all. I don't know exactly how involved he was with the reshaping of the film, but
I'd love to ask him someday.
Yeah. Well, I mean, assuming that because he also made what was it, Lockdown, not too long ago. That would have been during like 2020 and stuff. I don't know if that kept him off of this.
Yeah. And I think like around the time that, this thing was like really hitting the shelf was when American Made was, in its final stages. So he was pretty busy.
Yeah. I mean, he keeps busy, but, yeah, I mean, I'm assuming the reason they didn't just put this on VOD like they did with a lot of films in 2020 was because it was super expensive. So they wanted to make as much money as they could. They wanted to recoup
$100 million budget.
Right. They wanted to recoup as much of this as possible. And two, I'm assuming contract-wise that Daisy Ridley and Tom Holland, like they had in their contracts, this got a theatrical release of some sort, based on their massive success on those properties that you just mentioned. That would be my guess, but I don't exactly know why they pushed it to theaters. But yeah, we're kind of in this point now where like theaters are slowly starting to open up again, but they're kind of doing a lot of like testing the waters right now where like studios are putting the movies that they seem less sure on or the movies they kind of gave up on.
Yeah.
Just to kind of like see if people will go to the theaters, and KS Walking was kind of the perfect candidate for that reason.
Actually, to your point there, they released this early in South Korea just a couple of weeks ago, like a week and a few days ago, and that's where like the majority of its box office has come so far, since it's just now hitting the U.S. and they're trying, man. Like they have an IMAX release for this. The only thing though is that they aren't really marketing it. I didn't watch a trailer for this, partly because I didn't see any marketing whatsoever. Like I'm not the kind of person who watches a lot of television like with ads or anything. So I don't know if a lot of other people were exposed to this movie, but I went into it. I didn't even know the premise of this. All I knew was that it was a sci-fi YA sort of thing where Tom Holland and Daisy Ridley has blonde hair for some reason. That's it. That's all I knew. And I didn't see any pieces about it. I didn't see any like magazines or like just any ads or anything at all. And I wonder if maybe part of that is that this budget is so big. This movie has only made $700,000 so far at the box office. We'll see how it does this weekend. I think at this point they're like, we can't afford to keep putting money into this thing. We kind of have to dump it like New Mutants was last year.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that stands out to me, I mean, I won't share my thoughts on the film too early, but It did stand out to me that this doesn't look like $100 million production. Like, it looks like a $50 production, which I'm assuming is because they probably spent like $50 million on the original shoot and then like $50 million to like basically do it over again.
They're saying it was only an extra 15, but I don't know if I believe that. I think the budget was probably more, but I mean, that's close to what you're talking about. I mean, it's not 50 million. It's looking, that was probably more like 80, 85, which I think they cut a lot from this film, which might explain why it cost more than it looks in the final product.
That could explain it, because there's like Nick Jonas is in this, but I kept forgetting he was in it. Same with David Oyelowo. Like, they both just kind of like come in and out of the narrative, and I kept wondering, like, is there stuff that was like meant for their stories that just kind of like got pushed to the side? But I don't really know what exactly got cut.
Yeah.
So
there are locations that are mentioned in this where you're like, oh, when are they going to go to that location? And they never do. You know, there's character threads that are never tied up that clearly they were teasing for a sequel. There were moments where I was like, oh, this must have been a flashback sort of thing, particularly with David Oyelowo, but they just scrapped that entirely. Probably because the flashback stuff would have been probably too like bad, or bad in the sense of like too harrowing to watch, considering what happens. Yeah.
And there are two climaxes basically as well, which is a little odd, but nevertheless, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk then about the movie itself. I mean, we're like halfway into this and we haven't even explained what is this movie. And I guess all of that is really important, though, just because I personally think this is a movie that's probably more interesting to talk about the production than it is the actual movie. But who knows, actually? I don't know. You just saw this movie, like just now. So you're fresh off of Chaos Walking. We're going to get your instant reaction. So what is this movie about, Will Ashton? And what'd you think?
So I mean, as you're alluding to, this is a sort of sci-fi fantasy western premise in that it involves characters in a not too distant future in another world. I don't know if they ever say what planet it is, but
they call it New World.
New World.
It doesn't have like a weird name or anything, you know, like it's not Triton. It's just New World.
I mean, it looks kind of like, they show like from the exterior, like it looks kind of like Earth, but if it had like Saturn rings around it. So, which
to me is just funny. It's like, it can't just look like Earth. Audiences will get confused. So give it a ring. Stuff that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it kind of, I mean, I just recently saw Love and Monsters, and it kind of looks like the same world as that, like kind of grittier version of that world, and like with like a few less monsters running around.
Immediately thought of that movie. Much better movie, I think.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty good. I know you talked about it already on the show, so I won't share my thoughts on that, I guess. But so basically in this world, for whatever reason, in this planet, men have the ability, or they can't help having their thoughts projected or heard by everyone around them. Like whatever they're thinking at any given time is seen and heard visually as well as, audibly. And because of this, later on, we learn that the planet has been inhabited only by men. All the women are gone through like this, grave tragedy that's only really alluded to throughout. And, Tom Holland is this kind of plucky 17 or something year old kid who is working on the farm with his dad, played by Demián Bichir, right? Bichir?
Demián Bichir.
Yeah, Demián Bichir.
His adoptive father.
Yeah. And, he's just trying to be a good kid, please everybody, but obviously his kind of puberty set allows his noise to be a lot more present than it is for other men in town. But that becomes more apparent when the first woman in years comes crash landing onto Earth, played by Daisy Ridley. And her story is obviously very mysterious. And when she has to team up with Tom Holland, a lot of hijinks ensue from there.
Hijinks, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of trekking and there's a lot of walking around. And so they call it the noise, which is whatever a man is thinking. It almost like it exudes out of their head through like visible ultraviolet sound waves. And it's so pronounced that like if you can really control it, you can even conjure up illusions based on your memories. And it's a cool setup, I think. The premise is interesting enough to like set up a plucky, you called him plucky. That was what I was thinking too, like a very quirky dynamic between him and this Viola character. I was thinking a lot of the movie WALL-E, honestly, where he's because he's like wandering this like dystopian place, and he's very lonely, and he's not really aware of like how things got to the way they are. But then a love interest kind of crashes on this planet. You see what I'm saying? And kind of just like shows him maybe there's more to life than he thought. It's very YA, I guess.
Oh, it's absolutely YA. Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned earlier, it does pretty much seem like it's cut from the same cloth as both Maze Runner and The Hunger Games. Like, it's basically kind of like that darker, gritty world of The Hunger Games, but then like the concept of Maze Runner. So it's very easy to see from Lionsgate's standpoint why they wanted to push this forward and for it to be their next big franchise starter. But alas, things didn't quite go as planned.
Mads Mikkelsen is the big bad in here. You can really tell from the get-go. He plays the mayor of this colony that they live in. And yeah, you can easily quickly tell this guy is bad news. Not just because it's Mads Mikkelsen, who usually has a pretty haunting persona, but they really make this Todd Hewitt guy, played by Tom Holland, just seem really dense about like the circumstances of what has caused the world to be the way it is. Like, I guess they play it up a little bit, like how naive he is, how he just sort of like assumes things, everything people has told him has been like very accurate, but clearly the audience is way ahead of this dude for the most part. But yeah, I liked Mikkelsen in this. I thought, he's always a good bad guy.
Oh, for sure. I mean, yeah, as you mentioned, like they kind of maybe overdo the villainous part of it. Like they give him a scar and a big hat and a pelt and, like a menacing growl. And it's just like, You can kind of just stick to two of those. You don't have to do everything.
He's like the Mr. Potato Man of Potato Head of bad guy tropes. David Oyelowo is in this as well as a kind of zealot who kind of worships noise and is very like controlling with people in this colony, this only men colony of like, you don't hide your noise, you have to like really like pronounce it. And he's very miscast, I have to say. Right? I mean, I don't know if I'm alone in this. Oyelowo, I did not find him frightening at all. He gets one scene in this where I'm like, that's actually pretty terrifying, and it's toward the end, but all the way up until that I was just sort of like, oh, maybe he's kind of like the nice guy who's just kind of like got a chip on his shoulder. But I don't know, it felt like a performance that should have been a bit darker. I don't know if I have a weird hang up on that.
I didn't really mind Oyelowo that much, mainly because I just felt like the movie mostly forgot about him for most of the film. Like it just kind of felt like they never really figured out what his deal was, so they just kind of, left him to the side. But performance-wise, I thought he was fine. But the only person I felt was really, truly miscast was Nick Jonas. And I think you were mentioning this before. Like, he's trying to be, like, sort of menacing, like, malicious in some way, and I just don't buy it from him. Not to say that he is incapable of doing that, but in this film, it just kind of felt like he was sort of trying to be, like, both, like, kind of like a dumb jock kind of guy and also, like, a genuine, threatening, menacing dude. And I didn't really buy it throughout.
I disagree. I don't think that's the point of his character. I think the point is he's trying to come off threatening and he just doesn't. The movie kind of frames him around like wanting to be like living up to his dad, because his dad is Mads Mikkelsen, right? And he clearly like doesn't have the respect of his dad, and he clearly like messes up a lot, and he wants to be tough, but like the movie constantly like knocks him down a peg. So I had the same feeling, Will. I was like, he's kind of miscast here. But then eventually I was like, oh, I kind of see what they're going for. Like, it makes sense conceptually. It's just an execution. It's not a very entertaining character. He's not in the movie enough for me to like connect or care about him whatsoever.
But even still, like, I don't really buy Nick Jonas as someone who's like befuddled or like not like truly that like overwhelmed in that way.
You wanted Noah Centineo to be in this, didn't you?
I don't know about him per se, but I don't know. I think considering that Tom Holland is a lot better kind of doing that like befuddled, like boyish kind of thing than like someone like Nick Jonas, even though they're obviously playing totally different type of characters. I just don't.
Yeah, they're rivals and two sides of the same coin in a way.
I mean, Nick Jonas, obviously he's very accomplished as a musician. I just don't think he really found his niche yet as an actor. I know he did the first Jumanji movie. But,
yeah. Well, he was in the second one too.
Oh, is he? I forgot. I mean, I mostly have forgotten the second one, admittedly. But he's kind of coming into his own, I guess, as an actor. I don't really quite know where he's going to land, but I imagine they're going to probably cast him in like some Netflix rom-com. He's going to be a real heartthrob, and that's going to be his niche, and we'll go from there.
It's interesting to see Cynthia Erivo in this. This is way before Harriet and some of the roles that kind of pushed her star power a little bit further in recent years. But again, another character definitely feels like probably had more to do in the original draft and is kind of maybe would have had more to do in a sequel, but I just don't think a sequel is ever going to happen with this. And then I got to say, I think here's the thing with Daisy Ridley. So the casting is good. It makes perfect sense. Daisy Ridley is a very talented actor. And I think she and Tom Holland, there is something there to like make that dynamic work. The problem with this movie, the only thing about this movie that I think is a very, very iffy flaw, is that too much of it is Tom Holland, his thoughts embarrassing himself in front of her and her barely reacting to it. That is 90% of this movie.
Yeah.
And it really gets old after a while. Now, I give this movie a lot of slack. I actually kind of think it's pretty enjoyable to watch, and it's not bad. And I have a lot of nice things to say about it. But that one aspect of it is the reason I think that most people are probably going to tune out of this, because it's a lot of just Tom Holland communicating constantly. Like we always know what's going on with him, and we just don't know anything about her, really. Like there are just some moments where she kind of opens up a little bit, but I don't know. I think that this character just doesn't get to have even close to the same amount of interaction with the audience or with Tom Holland. So it's just such an imbalanced pair and an imbalanced dynamic. So that to me is what holds this movie back from being, I think right now it's watchable. I think it's, entertaining enough. You watch it once and forget about it in a couple of months, but it could have been much better. I think if they had really handled that character dynamic, this could have been like an easy recommend, but as it is, I think it's a very, very cautious recommend. But even though I had fun with it for the most part, but it feels like you're probably a bit more negative than I am.
Yeah, but I don't think I'm that negative compared to other people. Like, for instance, I've been seeing a lot on either Rotten Tomatoes or Letterboxd, like 1 star, 1.5 out of 5-star reviews from this, probably because of the reputation that the movie has received. I think people kind of had their knives out for it already. And similar to you, I think I wanted to give it a little bit of slack because it was like, this movie's already been through so much that I don't want to come in to this like really that
too
mean
nice.
to it.
Yeah.
I mean, mainly because like you were saying before, like the premise of it is interesting, and I think there's a cool movie to be made here. Like I think there's something here that's, it's not just a tired retread of a lot of other YA properties, even though it feels like that throughout. Like I think the premise itself could have been a little bit more, like you said, quirky, or a little bit more diverse in some way that it could stand out in a very crowded market. And I think the movie itself does to some extent salvage itself. Like I remember hearing when the original Doug Liman cut came out that it was apparently unreleasable, and I don't know if I ever heard why, but I mean, I'm assuming it's because the premise of it, which is probably why the pre-production went so long as well, is that it's such a hard thing to visualize the noise and to like make that a concept that's understandable and digestible to a wide audience. And I don't envy them for that, because that is something that's easier to do on the page than it is on the screen. But I think the problem with the movie is that they course corrected it too much to the point where everything is just been so like desensitized. Kind of they wrung out everything that might have been quirkier or weirder about this film to the point where it just feels like kind of a like vanilla version of this film. And I felt because of that, like the scripting of it just felt very basic. Like it felt like a lot of studio notes dictated the reshoots, to the point where I just didn't really feel like these characters came alive. Like a lot of it just felt like setting things up. Like a lot of the internal dialogue didn't feel sincere to me. Like you said, there's not a whole lot of chemistry between Daisy Ridley and Tom Holland, but that's not to say that their performances are bad. I think they're both fine. I think Daisy Ridley is a little bit better in this than Tom Holland. I do think Tom Holland in general is a pretty natural actor, but in this he kind of went back and forth, and I don't exactly know if that was just because of the reshoots or what. But I think by and large, like as a world building exercise and as a failed franchise starter, I think it could have been a lot worse. I mean, I'm very curious to know what the original cut of this version of this movie is, because I mean, if it was truly
release the Liman cut.
Yes. I say release the Charlie Kaufman cut. I want to see that script. I want to see what he did with this.
At least read it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think, as you were probably mentioning before, like his version of this probably would have been a lot more like weird and introspective, even though I believe he came onto this as like a studio for hire kind of screenwriter to like, I think basically just get some financial support during his novel writing process. But I don't really know what he did, if he did anything unique with the script, but I'd be much more curious to read that version of this and whatever they ultimately put together, because it just, like I said, it just feels like a very studio mandated film. Like, let's just basically try to salvage it. It's not like a Doolittle situation where like you can tell like this, they kept throwing this stuff in to like make it more appealing to kids and it's awkward and weird. Like, it's not that. It is, like you said, pretty watchable, but I just feel like it's ultimately a fairly generic film to the point where like you said, I'm probably going to forget about most of it later on. The story around the film is ultimately more interesting than the film itself. And I wasn't super invested by the end, which is unfortunate because I like the people involved and I want it to be better.
Yeah, the ending is pretty weak just because there aren't enough set pieces in this that really stand out. There aren't set pieces in this in general. They're mostly just sort of chase scenes, very generic action scenes. There's like swimming through rapids quicker than the other person, like riding a motorcycle and dodging, but none of it is very stagey. None of the action is very interesting. I think the things that stand out in this movie and make it entertaining enough are, like you're kind of saying, I guess, the world building implications. There are some like sparkles or spackles of just interesting commentary here of like, what would society look like if men could not hide their thoughts? I wanted more of that for sure, but I liked how it raised this guy who is just so blunt. And there is this whole sort of thing I think of like, well, don't guys already just sort of say every little thing that pops into their head? We can definitely joke about that. But I mean, obviously, like there's tons of things that guys are thinking that like we keep to ourselves, and obviously we don't want other people to hear because we're guys and we're awful. Yeah. We have some dark thoughts. And I think that's where the Charlie Kaufman script probably would have gone a little bit farther with. I don't know. Yeah.
And this is the very much the PG-13 version of this film. I mean, to the point where it's just like, I mean, no, I'm not blaming it. It's anything. I'm just saying, like, if this were, I guess, closer to reality, especially for a straight heterosexual boy who just discovered women for the first time, I think there would be a lot more X-rated thoughts that come out of his head. Other than,
I think they allude though, if you're not around any sort of media or culture or anything to sort of sexualize you, it is sort of like he would be kind of innocent. I think that's how they're trying to get away with that.
That's an interesting idea. I don't think they communicate that, but I think that is an interesting thought. And
you kind of have to reach for it yourself. That's just what I did. But I do appreciate things in here too of like, he has just, it's very matter of fact that he has two gay fathers. And like, I do like moments like that just let this sort of be a little bit different from mainstream, even though it is pretty mainstream in other ways. I thought that's the scene where he fights a squid just like totally naked. I was like, where's that part? Where is that energy? That energy should be in every scene of this film where he's just kind of going more all out. I would have liked that a lot more. But you know what? As it is, I'm an extremely low B-. I was basically C+ for most of this film, but I think what brings it to B- for me is that I do think that it is a very entertaining mess, and I'm here for it. I think that of the movies coming out this week, it's actually one of the stronger ones, I think, at least in terms of having a nice time with it, watching it with friends and having fun conversations about it, even though it's not going to rock your world, your new world. But yeah, where do you land?
I'm a little bit more negative than you ultimately, just because I don't really find it that entertaining. Like I said, it is watchable. Like I think they salvage it enough to the point where like it doesn't become an absolute mess. You're able to follow it pretty well. The action is also decently clean, which I was surprised about. Like I was able to follow a lot of the action beats fairly well, with the exception of the end. The end kind of got a little bit messy in that regard, but not to the point where I was like totally, lost at sea with it. I think for its target audience for like tweens, I think they'll probably think it's fine. Like you said, I think they might be a little bit bored by it, but I don't think they're going to be like totally disinterested because it is pretty straightforward. They kind of stripped it down to its essentials, so I don't think they like waste time or anything like that. But at the same time, as you were suggesting, there's a funnier and a weirder movie in that to this premise that I think didn't come out or didn't reach its potential, and I think that's ultimately what kind of disinterests me throughout, is that like this is such an interesting premise. This is such a intriguing launching point for a film that shouldn't be this generic. And I guess because the studio ultimately favored something that was just sort of cut and dry and salvageable, that it kind of lost its pulp along the way. And I think for me that makes it disappointing in a different respect, in that like it is kind of similar to something like New Mutants, in that ultimately it's just sort of dull. It doesn't really, rock the boat outside of its outlandish production. But I didn't hate it. I think it's a fairly serviceable C. Like I think it could have been way, way worse than it ultimately was. And I do applaud the people involved for making it certainly a lot easier to digest than it could have been otherwise. But at the same time, it doesn't really leave much of an impression. So it wasn't salvaged that much, but it's okay.
It's just okay. All right. Well, I think, we're not too far apart, I don't think. And yeah, if you want to see it for yourself, you can watch it in select theaters right now. I believe it's playing across the U.S. As of tomorrow. And so if it is safe for you to do so, you may consider. But of course, as always, we definitely urge you to social distance, wear masks, all of that stuff. Stay safe out there. Get the vaccine when you can. And we'll see how close this thing gets to $100 million box office. I don't know if it's going to make it for some reason. I have very low expectations for that. But yeah, it's 109 minutes long, and you can watch it now. Thank you so much for listening to our show. Be sure to subscribe to Cinemaholics on your favorite podcast app of choice or find us on YouTube. See you all next time.